The late afternoon sunlight bathed the Turner home in a golden glow, illuminating the well-kept hedges and neatly manicured lawn. The backyard, an intimate yet spacious retreat, was alive with quiet joy. Strings of twinkling lights crisscrossed the yard, casting a warm glow over the guests who mingled beneath them. Laughter and soft conversation mingled with the scent of fresh flowers, carried on the gentle breeze of an early summer evening. Abigail Turner stood near the center of it all, her white dress flowing softly in the breeze. She was radiant, her smile the kind that came easily, naturally, as she greeted guests with a quiet elegance that mirrored her life's work. As a judge, Abigail had built her reputation on fairness and integrity, qualities that seemed to shine even brighter on this day. Beside her stood her husband, Marcus, his presence both commanding and kind. Tall and composed, Marcus was the type of man whose mere posture conveyed respect. Years in the FBI had given him a sharp eye and steady demeanor. But tonight, his focus was entirely on his wife and their guests. His hand rested lightly on Abigail's shoulder as they exchanged a glance. A small, unspoken affirmation of the moment they had built together. Around them, the backyard was alive with life. Abigail's parents moved among the crowd, sharing proud stories of their daughter's achievements. Marcus's family, many of whom had traveled from across the country, filled the air with warm laughter and clinking glasses, their voices blending harmoniously with the soft background music. Children darted between the tables, their laughter a joyful punctuation to the subdued elegance of the evening. The couple had chosen their home for the wedding because it felt personal, authentic. The backyard represented not only their shared dreams but also the life they had carefully built together. Abigail often said it was a reflection of their values, open yet secure, welcoming but grounded. For their guests, it felt like stepping into a space of unity and celebration, a temporary respite from the complexities of the world outside. Not everyone viewed the evening with the same sentiment. Just a few houses down the street, Mrs. Rose sat in her dimly lit living room, her sharp eyes peering through lace curtains. The faint hum of music and laughter from the Turner house drifted through her window, though it carried none of the warmth she might have felt had she been among the guests. Mrs. Rose was the neighborhood's self-appointed watchman, a longtime resident. She often spoke with quiet pride about how the area had changed over the decades, though her tone carried the weight of unspoken judgments. Tonight, as she watched the diverse group of guests move about the Turners' backyard, a familiar unease stirred within her. "It's not what it used to be," she muttered to herself, her fingers tightening around her teacup. To Mrs. Rose, the Turners' celebration seemed somehow out of place. Not because it was loud or disruptive, but because it didn't fit her narrow image of what belonged. Her gaze lingered on the guests, her thoughts a tangled web of outdated beliefs and unspoken biases. Finally, with a sharp sigh, she set her teacup down and reached for her phone. The number she dialed was one she had called before, her voice taking on a clipped, authoritative tone as she spoke. "There's a disturbance," she said, her words deliberate. "A large group unfamiliar faces. It's loud, suspicious. At the Turner home, the celebration continued, blissfully unaware of Mrs. Rose's call. Abigail stood near the buffet table, laughing softly at a story her childhood friend was recounting. Marcus, a few steps away, was deep in conversation with his uncle about an upcoming family reunion. The children had begun an impromptu game of tag near the edge of the yard, their energy a bright contrast to the relaxed demeanor of the adults. The atmosphere was perfect, a snapshot of love and unity. Guests clinked their glasses in toasts, their smiles illuminated by the soft glow of the lights overhead. Abigail and Marcus shared a quiet dance under the pergola, their movements simple and unhurried, as if savoring the moment. But outside the edges of the backyard, headlights pierced the growing dusk. A quiet rumble of approaching cars broke through the harmony of the evening. Though no one noticed at first, the cars came to a stop just beyond the hedge, and figures stepped out, adjusting their belts and exchanging brief, muted words. Their silhouettes loomed in the distance, their movements purposeful. It wasn't until the first flicker of red and blue lights reflected against the house's windows that one of the younger guests noticed. "Police?" he murmured, his voice drawing the attention of others nearby. A murmur spread through the crowd, growing louder as more people turned toward the source of the disturbance. Confusion settled over the gathering, a faint tension breaking through the joyful atmosphere. Abigail noticed the shift immediately. Her laughter faded as her gaze followed the murmurs toward the driveway. The knot of unease that formed in her chest was mirrored in Marcus's expression as he moved to stand beside her. "What's going on?" Abigail asked quietly, her voice calm but edged with concern. Marcus squeezed her hand, his own eyes scanning the scene. "Stay calm," he said softly. "We'll handle it." From the shadows, a line of uniformed officers emerged, their expressions impassive as they approached the backyard. The lead officer, a tall man with a stiff demeanor, stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on his holster. His gaze swept over the gathering, his tone authoritative as he spoke. "We've received reports of a disturbance," he said, his voice cutting through the hum of conversation. "Everyone needs to remain where they are." The guests, unsure of how to respond, exchanged nervous glances. Abigail and Marcus moved instinctively toward the officer, their steps slow but deliberate. This was their home, their celebration. Whatever misunderstanding had occurred, they were certain they could resolve it with calm and reason. As they approached the lead officer, Abigail offered a polite smile, her voice measured. "Good evening, officer. This is a private event. Our wedding. In fact, I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding." The officer's gaze lingered on Abigail, then shifted to Marcus. His expression didn't soften. "We've received reports of suspicious activity," he said. "We need to investigate." The joy of the evening began to fade, replaced by an unease that settled over the guests like a heavy fog. Abigail and Marcus stood together, their calm composure masking the growing knot of worry in their chests. What should have been the happiest day of their lives was shifting, slowly and inexorably, towards something they couldn't yet define but instinctively knew would leave a lasting mark. The backyard, once a haven of joy, grew quieter as the murmurs of confusion spread among the guests. The clinking of glasses and soft laughter gave way to anxious glances, the kind exchanged when the unexpected disrupts what was supposed to be a perfect moment. Abigail and Marcus stood at the forefront, their composed faces hiding the unease building beneath the surface. The lead officer approached them with deliberate steps, his uniform crisp under the glow of the twinkling lights. His demeanor was stern, authoritative, but not outwardly aggressive. At least, not yet. Behind him, other officers fanned out, their presence commanding attention. A few guests shifted nervously, instinctively moving closer to their loved ones. Abigail stepped forward, her posture calm, her voice steady. "Good evening, officer," she said. "This is a private event. Our wedding. Can we help you with something?" The officer's eyes scanned the gathering, his expression unreadable. "We received a call," he said flatly, "a noise complaint, and reports of suspicious activity." The words hung in the air, their weight heavier than their surface meaning. Abigail knew what he wasn't saying outright. The subtext carried in the tone, the phrasing, suspicious activity. Two words that often served as a veil for deeper biases. She could feel Marcus tense slightly beside her, though his voice remained measured. "This is a peaceful celebration, officer," Marcus said. "We're more than happy to address any concerns. But I assure you, there's nothing suspicious happening here." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze lingered on Marcus, a subtle narrowing of his eyes that didn't go unnoticed. It was the kind of look Marcus had encountered many times before, one that questioned his place in spaces like this. He held the officer's gaze, not in defiance, but with the quiet assurance of someone who had spent years navigating such moments. Behind them, Abigail could hear the whispers among the guests, the unease growing as the officers began to move through the gathering. Some guests offered polite smiles, others stiffened visibly under the weight of scrutiny that felt unearned. It wasn't what the officers said that created the tension, it was what wasn't said, the silent assumptions lurking beneath their presence. "Do you have identification?" the officer asked, his tone neutral but clipped. Abigail tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. Identification, she repeated. To host a wedding in our own backyard? It's routine, the officer replied, his voice carrying a rehearsed detachment. We need to confirm. Abigail reached for her purse, producing her ID with the deliberate movements of someone who had learned to mask her frustration with poise. Marcus did the same, handing his over without a word. The officer studied the IDs, his brow furrowing slightly as he read their names and titles. Judge Turner, he said, glancing at Abigail. There was no hint of recognition in his voice, only the faintest flicker of something, perhaps surprise, perhaps discomfort. And Agent Turner, he continued, his eyes shifting to Marcus. FBI? Yes, Marcus said simply, his tone even. And as I'm sure you're aware, we're both familiar with the law. So if there's anything specific you'd like to address, we'd be happy to clarify. The officer handed back their IDs without comment, but his expression remained tense. Behind him, one of the younger officers was speaking with a group of guests, his voice audible enough to catch Abigail's attention. Is this your first time in the neighborhood? The officer was asking. His tone casual but his phrasing pointed. One of Marcus's cousins, a soft-spoken man in his late 20s, responded cautiously. No, we're here for the wedding. Just checking, the officer replied, his smile thin. We've had some concerns raised about unfamiliar faces. Abigail felt a knot tighten in her chest. She exchanged a glance with Marcus, whose jaw tightened imperceptibly. They both understood what was happening. The quiet othering, the implication that their guests didn't belong, even in a space they had been invited to. It wasn't overt, but it didn't need to be. The impact was the same. One of the older guests, a family friend in her 70s, approached Abigail with a worried expression. What's going on, dear? She asked softly. Why are they questioning people like this? Abigail placed a reassuring hand on the woman's arm, her smile steady but strained. It's just a misunderstanding, she said. We'll sort it out. But even as she spoke, she could see the atmosphere shifting. Guests who had been laughing and mingling now stood in smaller groups, their conversations hushed. The children, once running freely across the yard, had retreated to the safety of their parents' sides. It was as if the very air had grown heavier. The joy of the evening dulled by the silent tension that comes when people feel they must explain their right to simply exist in a space. Abigail turned back to the lead officer. I'd like to know the nature of the complaint, she said, her voice firm but polite. What exactly are you investigating here? The officer hesitated, his expression unreadable. Like I said, there were reports of noise and unusual activity. Unusual how? Marcus asked, his tone carrying a quiet intensity. Because from where I'm standing, this looks like a wedding. People laughing, talking, celebrating, nothing more. The officer didn't answer directly. Instead, he gestured to his colleagues, who continued to circulate through the guests, their presence more intrusive than investigative. Abigail watched as one officer stopped a teenager and asked for identification. Despite the fact that he was clearly just a guest, the boy's hands shook slightly as he fumbled with his wallet, and the officer's eyes lingered on him in a way that made Abigail's stomach turn. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. Officer, I trust that your intent is to resolve any concerns efficiently, but I must remind you that this is private property, and these are our guests. I'd appreciate it if your team would proceed with the respect this situation warrants. The officer's gaze snapped to hers, and for a moment, the two held each other's stare. Abigail could see the faint flicker of resistance in his eyes, the reluctance to cede even an inch of authority. But she didn't waver, her calm resolve as unyielding as the principles she had built her life on. We're just doing our job, the officer said finally, his tone sharper than before. And I expect you to do it fairly. Abigail replied. Nothing more, nothing less. The officer said nothing, but his expression tightened. Abigail took a step back, her hands resting lightly at her sides. But her presence remained firm. Marcus moved closer, his arm brushing hers in a silent show of solidarity. The tension lingered, unspoken but palpable. The officers continued their patrol of the yard, their actions carrying a weight that no one wanted to name aloud but everyone felt. Abigail and Marcus stood together, their composure intact. But the evening had shifted irreversibly. What should have been a celebration of love and unity was now shadowed by the subtle, insidious reminder that for some, the burden of proof never ends. The evening air, once filled with the soft hum of celebration, now carried a tension that seemed to settle into the spaces between conversations. The officers moved deliberately through the gathering, their presence commanding attention without words. The flashing blue and red lights from the parked squad cars outside cast fleeting shadows on the faces of the guests, a reminder of the disruption that had entered this carefully planned moment of joy. Abigail Turner observed everything with a sharp, discerning gaze. Though her voice remained calm, her thoughts churned. She had spent her career upholding the law, believing in its ability to protect and to serve. Yet tonight, the system she had dedicated herself to felt distant and cold, its representatives wielding authority in a way that stifled rather than reassured. Marcus stood beside her, his presence steady as always. He had been trained to remain composed in tense situations, to analyze before acting, but even he felt the strain. He caught sight of one officer questioning an elderly guest, the woman's face lined with confusion as she fumbled through her purse for identification. "Ma'am, I just need to see some ID," the officer said, his tone measured but insistent. "This is my niece's wedding," the woman replied, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm not sure why." "Standard procedure," the officer interrupted. He didn't raise his voice, but the firmness in his tone left little room for further explanation. Marcus's jaw tightened as he turned to Abigail. "They're not here to listen," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the guests. Abigail nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. She had seen this before. Not in her courtroom, but in the stories brought before her. A subtle dismissal of explanations. A refusal to acknowledge the humanity behind the faces. It was a quiet dismissal, unspoken yet palpable. Nearby, Marcus's younger cousin, a teenager dressed neatly in a button-down shirt, stood stiffly as another officer rifled through his backpack. The boy's hands remained at his sides, his posture tense. "What's this about?" Marcus asked as he approached, his voice calm but firm. The officer didn't look up. "Routine check," he said curtly. "Routine," Marcus repeated, his tone even. "You're searching a child's bag at a wedding. That doesn't strike me as routine." The officer paused, his gaze flickering briefly to Marcus before continuing. "We've had reports of suspicious activity." Marcus let out a slow breath, his hands at his sides. "And that suspicion is directed at a teenager carrying nothing but a notebook and a water bottle?" The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood, gesturing for the boy to step aside. "Just doing my job," he said before walking off. Marcus turned to his cousin, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're all right," he said quietly. The boy nodded but avoided his gaze, his discomfort evident. The guests, meanwhile, had begun to cluster together in small groups. Their conversations were hushed, their laughter long gone. For many, this wasn't the first time they had encountered such moments, where celebration turned to scrutiny, where belonging was questioned without reason. It was a familiar discomfort, one that had been folded into their lives in ways they rarely spoke of but always felt. Abigail's father, a retired school principal, stood near the edge of the crowd. His face, usually composed, was tight with controlled anger. He approached Abigail, his voice low but steady. "This isn't right," he said. "These officers aren't here to keep the peace. They're here to make a point." Abigail met his gaze, her expression softening slightly. "I know," she said, "but we can't escalate. Not tonight." Her father nodded reluctantly, though his fists remained clenched at his sides. He looked over at Marcus, who was now speaking with another group of guests, offering quiet reassurances. "What's the plan?" he asked. "We stay calm," Abigail replied. "We remind them of the law if necessary. But we don't give them anything they can use against us." As she spoke, she noticed the lead officer watching her from across the yard. His expression was unreadable, but his stance, arms crossed, shoulders rigid, conveyed a quiet resistance. He seemed to sense that Abigail and Marcus were not ordinary civilians, that their presence demanded a level of caution he hadn't anticipated. Yet that caution seemed to irritate him, as though it threatened his authority. The officers continued their patrol, their movements methodical. They questioned a few more guests, their inquiries framed as routine but laced with subtle skepticism. Each exchange added another layer to the unease that hung over the gathering. One guest, a woman in her 60s who had been a family friend for decades, stepped forward to address the lead officer. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of someone who had lived through too many moments like this. "Officer," she said, "I don't understand why this is happening. This is a private event. A peaceful one. Can you explain why we're being treated this way?" The officer looked at her, his expression neutral. "We're responding to a call," he said. "We have to investigate." The woman frowned. "Investigate what? A wedding? These are good people. There's no reason for this." "It's standard procedure," the officer replied. "If everything checks out, we'll be on our way." Abigail stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "Officer, I'd like to remind you that this is private property. You're here without a warrant, detaining and questioning our guests without cause. That's not procedure. That's overreach." The officer's gaze hardened. "Ma'am, I suggest you let us do our job. And I suggest you do it within the bounds of the law," Abigail replied, her tone unyielding. "We're more than willing to cooperate. But this treatment is unacceptable." The standoff lasted only a moment, but the weight of it lingered. The officer finally looked away, signaling to one of his colleagues to regroup. Abigail and Marcus exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of what was at stake. The evening continued under this uneasy truce, the guests subdued but watchful. Abigail and Marcus remained at the center of it all, their composure steady but their resolve hardening. They knew this wasn't about noise complaints or routine checks. It was about something deeper, something unspoken yet unmistakable. And as the night wore on, the quiet divide between what was said and what was meant became impossible to ignore. The night deepened, its quiet punctuated by the occasional murmur of uneasy conversations and the faint rustle of the trees bordering the yard. The celebration had stilled, its joy muted by the unwelcome presence of authority. Guests stood in small groups, their voices low, casting glances toward the officers who continued to move through the gathering with a measured air. Abigail and Marcus remained close to one another, their calm exterior masking a growing sense of frustration. They were accustomed to navigating challenging situations, Abigail in her courtroom and Marcus in his investigations. But tonight felt different. This was their home, their wedding, and the presence of these officers felt not like a duty-bound investigation but an intrusion. Abigail's mother approached quietly, her expression a mixture of concern and quiet anger. "Why are they still here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've explained everything. What more do they want?" Abigail placed a reassuring hand on her mother's arm, though the question lingered in her mind as well. "I don't know," she said, keeping her voice steady, "but we need to stay calm. They're looking for a reason to escalate, and we're not going to give it to them." Across the yard, one of the younger officers was speaking with Marcus's uncle, a retired teacher in his 60s. The officer's stance was firm, his tone clipped, though his words were just polite enough to avoid outright hostility. The uncle, a man of quiet dignity, answered each question with measured precision, but his discomfort was evident. "Is there a reason you're asking me this?" he said finally. His voice calm but direct. "I'm here for my nephew's wedding. That's all there is to it. It's just routine," the officer replied, his words familiar by now. Routine. The term felt hollow, a catch-all justification that obscured the reality of the moment. Marcus, watching the exchange from a few steps away, resisted the urge to intervene. He knew his presence would shift the dynamic, but he also understood the power of restraint. One of the officers near the house began walking toward the back door, his eyes scanning the interior through the glass panes. Abigail noticed immediately and stepped forward, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "Excuse me, officer," she said, "you don't have permission to enter the house." The officer paused, turning to face her. "Just taking a look," he said, his tone dismissive, "making sure everything's in order." Abigail's expression remained calm, but her voice sharpened slightly. "Unless you have a warrant, you have no right to enter." This is private property, and I'm asking you to respect that. The officer hesitated, his hand lingering near his belt. For a moment, it seemed as though he might challenge her, but something in her tone, or perhaps the weight of her gaze, caused him to step back. Fine, he said, his voice clipped, but we're not done here. The interaction drew the attention of several guests, their murmurs growing louder. Marcus moved to stand beside Abigail, his presence a steadying force. Together, they turned to face the officers, their stance unyielding. Nearby, one of the children began to cry softly, clinging to his mother's leg as she tried to soothe him. The sight was almost too much for Abigail to bear. This was supposed to be a night of joy, of family and unity. Instead, it had become a reminder of the silent divide that still lingered beneath the surface of their lives. One that could be stirred into the open with a single phone call. The lead officer stepped forward again, his expression hardening. We're trying to do our job, he said, his tone tinged with irritation. But you're making it difficult. Abigail met his gaze without flinching. Your job is to uphold the law, she said evenly, and that includes respecting the rights of the people here. No one is interfering with your investigation. But I won't stand by and let our guests be treated like suspects. The officer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Marcus took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. Officer, we've been cooperative. We've answered your questions, provided identification, and allowed you to speak with our guests. But it's clear there's no issue here. I suggest you conclude your investigation before this escalated further. The officer's gaze flickered, a brief moment of uncertainty crossing his face. Behind him, some of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence now tempered by the quiet resolve of the couple before them. Still, the tension remained. It was the kind that didn't need raised voices or overt aggression to be felt. It was in the way the officers lingered a moment too long on certain guests. The way their questions carried an implicit doubt. The way their presence itself seemed to challenge the legitimacy of the celebration. As the night wore on, the divide became clearer. For some, it was a reminder of battles fought long ago, of moments when they had been asked to justify their place in spaces they had every right to occupy. For others, it was a sobering realization of how quickly joy could be overshadowed by suspicion. Abigail and Marcus stood together, their resolve unwavering. They had chosen this moment, this union, as a testament to their love and resilience. And while they hadn't anticipated this challenge, they faced it with the same quiet strength that had defined their lives. The night continued, but the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. The officers eventually began to retreat, their questions tapering off, their movements less assertive. Yet the damage had been done. The joy of the evening had been fractured, replaced by a quiet understanding of the work that still lay ahead. As the last of the officers left, the guests began to relax slightly, though the weight of the encounter lingered. Abigail and Marcus exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of what had transpired and what it meant. In the stillness that followed, Abigail turned to her mother, who had remained nearby throughout the ordeal. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Her mother nodded, her expression tired but resolute. "I'm fine," she said, "but this isn't over." Abigail knew she was right. This was just one night, one moment in a larger story that was far from finished. As she looked out over the yard, at the faces of her family and friends, she felt a quiet determination settle within her. This wasn't just about their wedding. It was about something much bigger, something that demanded to be faced with courage and grace. The evening may have been disrupted, but its purpose remained intact. Abigail and Marcus stood hand in hand, their resolve unshaken, ready to face whatever came next. The yard had returned to a semblance of calm, though it was a fragile peace. The flashing lights of the patrol cars were gone, leaving behind an empty stillness that seemed to settle over the gathering like a heavy fog. Guests moved quietly, their voices hushed as if unwilling to disturb the uneasy air that hung over the evening. Laughter, which had once filled the space, felt like a distant memory. Abigail stood near the edge of the yard, her gaze fixed on the rows of twinkling lights that had once illuminated a joyous celebration. Her white dress was no longer pristine, the hem was dusted with the remnants of the evening's events. Yet she stood tall, her posture composed, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Marcus joined her, his presence grounding her. He didn't speak right away, understanding that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. Instead, he placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. A silent gesture of solidarity. "They're gone," he said finally, his voice low and steady. Abigail nodded. For now. The guests had begun to reassemble, their initial shock giving way to the need for connection. Small groups formed again, but their conversations carried a different tone, subdued, introspective. The evening, meant to be a celebration of love and unity, had become a reminder of how easily suspicion could intrude on even the most sacred moments. Abigail's father approached, his expression both tired and resolute. "The neighbors are still watching," he said, gesturing subtly toward the house next door. A flicker of movement behind the curtains confirmed his words. Abigail glanced toward the window, her gaze unwavering. "Let them watch," she said quietly. "They've already done enough damage." Her father sighed but said nothing more. He understood that Abigail's words carried more weight than they appeared to. The neighbors' actions were a reflection of something larger, something that lingered just beneath the surface of their lives but was rarely spoken of directly. Nearby, Marcus's cousin was sitting with a group of younger guests, their voices soft as they shared their experiences from the evening. One young man, no older than 20, shook his head as he spoke. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his tone laced with disbelief. "And still, they looked at me like I didn't belong here." Another nodded in agreement. "It's not just the police. It's the way they watched us. The way they questioned every little thing. Like we had to prove we were supposed to be here." Their words struck a chord with Marcus, who had heard similar sentiments many times before. As an FBI agent, he had dedicated his career to upholding the law, to protecting those who needed it most. Yet moments like these reminded him of the limitations of his badge, of how it couldn't shield him, or those he cared about, from the quiet prejudices that shaped their daily lives. Abigail stepped forward, her voice carrying just enough to draw their attention. "You don't have to explain yourselves to anyone," she said firmly. "Not tonight, not ever. What happened here wasn't about you. It was about their inability to see beyond their own biases." The young guests listened intently, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and lingering frustration. Abigail's words carried weight, not because of her title, but because of the quiet authority with which she spoke. She understood their pain, not just as a witness to tonight's events, but as someone who had faced similar moments throughout her life. Marcus turned to the older guests, many of whom had gathered near the buffet table. They spoke in quieter tones, their words reflective rather than reactive. One man, a family friend in his 70s, shook his head as he addressed the group. "It's not new," he said. "We've seen this before. Different uniforms, same story." Another nodded, her expression solemn. They didn't even try to hide it. The questions, the looks, it was all right there. "But what do we do about it?" someone else asked, their voice tinged with both anger and exhaustion. "We've been dealing with this for generations. When does it end?" The question lingered, unanswered. It wasn't that they lacked solutions, it was the weight of knowing how long the fight had already been, and how much longer it might continue. Marcus stepped closer, his voice steady as he addressed the group. "It doesn't end unless we keep pushing back," he said. "What happened tonight doesn't stay here. We document it, we share it, and we hold them accountable. That's how we move forward." The group fell silent for a moment, processing his words. Slowly, heads began to nod, their agreement quiet but resolute. They understood that the evening's events, as painful as they had been, were part of a larger story, one that required their participation to change its course. Abigail joined Marcus, her voice carrying the same steady determination. "We can't let what happened tonight define this moment," she said. "Yes, it was wrong. Yes, it was a violation of our rights. But it's also a reminder of why we need to stand together. To demand better, not just for us, but for everyone who comes after." Her words seemed to settle over the group like a calming balm. The tension didn't dissipate entirely, but it softened, replaced by a quiet determination to reclaim the evening's purpose. As the guests began to regroup, Abigail and Marcus remained at the center, their presence a beacon of strength. They moved from one group to the next, offering reassurances and listening to the stories their guests shared. It wasn't just about what had happened tonight. It was about the moments that came before. The silent battles each of them had faced in their own lives. Battles that often went unnoticed but were no less real. The night ended quietly. The guests lingered longer than expected, reluctant to leave without first expressing their gratitude to Abigail and Marcus for their strength. Their grace. As the last car pulled away, leaving the yard empty once more, the couple stood together under the lights. Marcus took Abigail's hand, his voice soft. "It wasn't the night we planned." "No," she replied, her tone equally quiet, "but it was the night we needed." They stood there for a moment longer, the weight of the evening settling over them. It wasn't just about their wedding anymore. It was about the conversations that had been started, the truths that had been revealed, and the resolve that had been strengthened. In the stillness, Abigail looked up at Marcus, her expression calm but resolute. "This isn't over," she said. Marcus nodded. "No, it's not." Together, they turned toward the house, the lights flickering softly behind them as they stepped inside. The morning after the wedding, sunlight poured through the windows of Abigail and Marcus's home, casting a warm glow on the quiet remnants of the celebration. Empty glasses and scattered flowers still adorned the backyard, a silent testimony to what the evening had meant before the interruption. Yet the stillness carried an undercurrent of unresolved tension, a reminder that the events of the night before had left more than just a mess to clean. Abigail sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She stared out the window, her expression thoughtful, her movements unhurried. Marcus entered the room quietly, his presence grounding as he placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "You didn't sleep much," he said. She shook her head, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Neither did you." He didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried weight, the kind that comes when words feel insufficient. "They'll talk about this," Abigail said finally, her voice soft but steady. "The neighbors, the guests, maybe even the officers themselves." "They already are," Marcus replied, sliding his phone across the table. On the screen were messages from family and friends who had been at the wedding. Their words a mix of support and outrage. There were also videos, clips taken by guests of the office's actions, already spreading on social media. Abigail scrolled through them slowly, her expression calm but her jaw tightening slightly as she watched. The footage was clear. Officers questioning guests with thinly veiled suspicion, searching without cause, dismissing explanations with an air of authority. It was all there, undeniable and deeply unsettling. "This is what they'll remember," she said quietly. "Not the vows, not the toasts. This. They'll remember both," Marcus said firmly. "But this needs to be seen. It needs to be addressed." Abigail nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on the screen. "It's just exhausting," she said after a pause. "To have to prove, over and over again, that we belong." Marcus reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I know," he said, "but it's not just about us. It's about everyone who's ever been in that position. We have a chance to make something out of this." Later that day, they began reaching out to their guests, checking in and ensuring everyone had made it home safely. Each conversation carried its own tone, a mix of gratitude for their care and lingering frustration over the previous night. "I've seen it before," said one elderly guest, her voice tinged with weariness. "But seeing it here, at your wedding, it just felt different, like they weren't even pretending to be fair." Another, younger guest expressed his anger more openly. "They didn't see us as people," he said. "They saw us as a problem." Abigail listened to each person patiently, offering reassurances while silently processing the weight of their words. These weren't new experiences for many of them, but the collective nature of the incident had magnified its impact. It was no longer just an individual story. It was a shared one. And that made it all the more significant. By the afternoon, Abigail and Marcus found themselves sitting in their living room, surrounded by notes and statements they had begun compiling. It was Marcus who suggested reaching out to a colleague of his, a civil rights attorney who specialized in cases of police misconduct. "She'll know what to do," Marcus said, dialing the number. "If nothing else, she'll help us navigate this." The conversation was brief but productive. The attorney, a woman named Simone, agreed to meet with them the following day. "We'll figure this out," she said, "but it's going to take time. Are you ready for that?" Abigail and Marcus exchanged a glance before answering in unison. Yes. As evening fell, the couple stepped out into the backyard. The space felt different now. Quieter but not in a comforting way. It was as though the events of the night before still lingered, their presence woven into the fabric of the space. Abigail knelt to pick up a fallen flower from one of the centerpieces, her fingers brushing the petals gently. "This was supposed to be about us," she said softly. "About our love, our family, our future." "It still is," Marcus replied, standing beside her. "What happened doesn't change that. It just added another layer." She stood, turning to face him. "A layer we didn't ask for." "No," he agreed, "but one we can't ignore." The next morning, Abigail and Marcus met with Simone in her office, a bright but modest space filled with books and framed photographs of past cases. She listened intently as they recounted the events of the wedding, taking detailed notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Your guests captured a lot of this on video," Simone said after they finished. "That's going to be important. The footage shows not just what they did, but how they did it, their tone, their body language. It all matters." "What happens next?" Abigail asked, her voice steady but curious. Simone leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "We file a formal complaint," she said, "and we prepare for pushback. Cases like this don't move quickly, and they don't resolve neatly. But if you're willing to see it through, we can make a difference." Abigail nodded slowly. "We are," she said, "whatever it takes." As they left Simone's office, Marcus placed a hand on Abigail's back, guiding her toward the car. The weight of the next steps loomed large, but so did their resolve. "This isn't just about us," Marcus said as they drove home. "It's about holding them accountable. About making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Abigail glanced at him, her expression calm but determined. "Then let's make sure it counts." That evening, as they sat together on the couch, the quiet of their home felt heavier than before. But it wasn't the kind of quiet that stifled. It was the kind that came before action. A pause before the first steps of a longer journey. And they were ready to take it. Together. The days following the wedding unfolded slowly, marked by a quiet sense of purpose. Abigail and Marcus had begun to organize their next steps. But the weight of the incident lingered. Its echoes felt in every conversation they had with their family and guests. It was as if the evening, so carefully planned to celebrate love and unity, now stood as a stark reminder of the barriers still deeply embedded in their lives. Abigail sat at her desk one morning, reviewing the notes she and Marcus had compiled. Each line, every detail from the night, felt heavy as she read them aloud to herself. The questions the officers had asked, the tone of their voices, the way they had lingered on certain guests, as if waiting for someone to make a wrong move. She underlined the phrase, "just routine," with a slow, deliberate motion, the words carrying more weight than they should have. The phone rang, breaking her concentration. It was Simone, the attorney, calling to update them on the formal complaint they had filed. "They've acknowledged receipt," Simone said, her tone neutral but steady. "Now we wait to see how they respond. It could take weeks, even months." Abigail nodded as she listened, her grip on the phone tightening slightly. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," Simone continued, "we make sure the story doesn't fade. The videos your guests recorded are powerful. They show the humanity of what happened. Not just the actions of the officers, but the fear and confusion they caused. We need to keep that alive." After the call, Abigail joined Marcus in the living room, where he was reviewing the same footage Simone had mentioned. He looked up as she entered, his expression thoughtful. "She's right," Marcus said, gesturing toward the screen. "This isn't just about us anymore. People need to see this for what it is." Abigail sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "It's not easy, though," she said quietly. Putting this out there means reliving it. Over and over again. Marcus nodded. I know. But maybe that's the point. Maybe by facing it, we force others to see it too. That evening, they held a small gathering at their home for some of the guests who had been at the wedding. It wasn't a party, nor was it meant to dwell on the events of that night. Instead, it was an opportunity to share stories, to find solidarity in their shared experiences. The atmosphere was subdued but warm. Guests spoke in quiet tones, their voices rising only occasionally as they recounted moments of frustration or disbelief. One man, a friend of Marcus's family, leaned forward in his chair as he spoke. What struck me most wasn't the questions, he said. It was the way they looked at us. Like we didn't belong. Like we were the intruders. Others nodded in agreement. A woman in her 60s added, it's not just what they did. It's what they assumed. We weren't people to them. We were something else. Abigail listened intently, her expression calm but focused. When the room grew quiet, she spoke, her voice steady. That's what makes this so important. She said, it's not just about what happened to us. It's about what it represents. This isn't the first time. And it won't be the last unless we make it clear that this kind of behavior isn't acceptable. The guests murmured their agreement, their resolve growing with each shared word. It wasn't anger that filled the room, but a quiet determination, a recognition that the only way forward was to confront the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. As the evening wound down, one of the younger guests approached Abigail and Marcus. He was a college student, quiet but thoughtful, and his presence carried a gravity beyond his years. I wanted to thank you, he said, his voice earnest, for standing up for us that night. It meant a lot to see you both hold your ground. Abigail smiled softly, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Thank you for being there, she said, and for sharing your voice. It matters, more than you know. After the guests had left, the house was quiet again. Abigail and Marcus sat together on the couch, the weight of the day settling over them. The fight ahead felt daunting, but they knew they weren't facing it alone. What do you think they'll say? Marcus asked after a long silence. The people who see the videos, who hear about this. Abigail thought for a moment before answering. Some will see what they want to see, she said. They'll say it wasn't as bad as we're making it out to be. That the officers were just doing their jobs. And the others? Marcus pressed. The others will see the truth, Abigail said firmly, and they'll understand that this isn't just about one night. It's about something much bigger. Something we all need to face. Marcus nodded, his expression resolute. Then we keep going. The next morning, they began sharing the videos online, accompanied by a statement written carefully but with purpose. It wasn't about retaliation, they made clear. It was about accountability, about ensuring that what had happened to them didn't happen to someone else. The response was immediate, the story gaining traction far beyond their neighborhood. Messages began pouring in, some from friends and allies, others from strangers who had seen the videos and felt compelled to reach out. Many shared their own stories, moments of quiet injustice that had left lasting scars. Each message was a reminder that their fight wasn't isolated. It was part of something larger, a collective call for change. As the days turned into weeks, Abigail and Marcus remained steadfast. They continued to meet with Simone, to speak with their community, to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. The weight of their efforts was heavy, but it was one they carried willingly, knowing that the cost of inaction would be far greater. In the stillness of their home, they found strength in one another. The journey was far from over, but they were ready to face it together, step by step, with the quiet determination that had carried them this far. Months passed, and the story of Abigail and Marcus's wedding had grown far beyond the confines of their home. It was no longer just a local incident but a narrative that had captured the attention of people across the country. The videos recorded by their guests had circulated widely, sparking debates, conversations, and even protests in some communities. Yet for Abigail and Marcus, life remained much the same, quiet, steady, and deeply rooted in purpose. The investigation into the office's actions progressed slowly. As these processes often did, Abigail and Marcus worked closely with Simone, meeting regularly to review updates and prepare for potential hearings. Each meeting was a reminder of the system's complexity, of how change rarely came quickly or easily. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows of their kitchen, Abigail sat with a stack of letters on the table before her. They had started arriving weeks ago, sent by strangers who had seen the videos and felt compelled to share their thoughts. Some were simple notes of support, while others told deeply personal stories of similar experiences. Each one carried a weight that Abigail could feel as she read. She held one letter in her hands, its paper slightly worn from being folded and unfolded. It was from a retired teacher in Ohio, a woman who described an incident decades ago in which she had been questioned by police while walking home from church. "I never told anyone about it," the letter read. "It felt too small, too insignificant to matter. But seeing your story gave me the courage to speak. Thank you for that." Marcus entered the room, his steps quiet as he approached. He placed a hand on Abigail's shoulder, glancing at the letter in her hands. "Another one?" he asked. She nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "They just keep coming." He sat across from her, his expression thoughtful. "It's humbling, isn't it, knowing that what we've been through has connected with so many people?" "It is," Abigail agreed, "but it's also a reminder of how much work there's still to do." The couple spent that day meeting with Simone, who brought them the latest updates from the investigation. The officers involved in the incident had been placed on administrative leave, and internal reviews were underway. The lead officer, whose dismissive attitude had set the tone for the evening, faced mounting scrutiny as evidence of past misconduct surfaced. "There's progress," Simone said, her tone measured. "But it's not just about these officers. It's about the culture that allowed this to happen. That's where the real challenge lies." Abigail nodded, her expression calm but resolute. "We're ready," she said simply. As they drove home, Marcus glanced at Abigail, his voice quiet. "Do you ever think about how different that night could have been? If just one thing had gone another way?" "All the time," she replied. "But that's not what happened. What happened was this. And now it's up to us to make sure it means something." In the weeks that followed, the couple continued to balance their personal lives with their growing role as advocates. They attended community forums, spoke at town hall meetings, and met with leaders and law enforcement to discuss reforms. Each appearance was an opportunity to share their story, not as victims, but as people determined to create change. One evening, they were invited to a gathering at a local community center, where residents had come together to discuss issues of racial bias and policing. The room was filled with people of all ages, their faces reflecting a mixture of frustration and hope. Abigail and Marcus sat near the front, listening as others shared their experiences. An older man stood to speak, his voice steady but lined with emotion. "It's not about hating the police," he said. "It's about holding them accountable. It's about making sure they see us as people, not problems." His words resonated deeply with Abigail, who later stood to address the group. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of her convictions. "What happened to us isn't unique," she began. "It's part of a pattern that too many of us recognize. But patterns can be broken. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with moments like this, when we come together. When we refuse to stay silent." The room erupted in quiet applause, a shared acknowledgement of the truth in her words. As the gathering concluded, several attendees approached Abigail and Marcus, thanking them for their courage and commitment. On the drive home, the couple reflected on the evening, their conversation marked by a shared sense of purpose. "It's not just about us anymore," Marcus said. "It's about all of them. Everyone who's been through this. Everyone who's still going through it. That's why we keep going," Abigail replied. Months later, the investigation concluded with significant consequences for the officers involved. Some were dismissed from the force, while others faced disciplinary action. The police department issued a formal apology, acknowledging the misconduct and committing to reforms. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. Abigail and Marcus sat on their porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The fight wasn't over, and they knew it never truly would be. But they also knew that progress, however slow, was still progress. As the first stars began to appear in the sky, Marcus turned to Abigail, his expression soft. "Do you think we made a difference?" he asked. She smiled, her hand resting lightly on his. "I think we did," she said, "and I think we'll keep making one." The quiet of the evening enveloped them, a reminder of the peace they had fought so hard to reclaim. Together, they sat in the stillness, ready for whatever came next.